Part 2. The Go-Getters. By the time of the Civil War, Americans had only begun to discover America. The land was still half explored, the highest mountains were still unclimbed, and the swiftest rivers still unmapped. Nobody had yet reached the top of Long's Peak in Colorado or Mount Whitney in California. The Colorado River began somewhere high in the Rockies. No one had traced its dangerous meanders. The shores of the Great Lakes were still a mystery. The bayous of Louisiana and the Everglades of Florida seemed dark and threatening. The gold rush to California in 1849 offered only a first glimpse of the treasures in mountain streams and deep under the earth. America was full of secret resources. A new kind of American, the go-getter, helped discover these treasures. Just as people with assorted dreams and hopes founded the nation, so a wide assortment of go-getters invented a new American way of life. Some were outdoor men who rode the range, leading thousands of cattle on new trails. Some were adventurous miners who risked fortunes to drill deep in search of mysterious new minerals. Some were businessmen, new-style storekeepers who tried to make the whole nation their customers. Some were engineers and inventors. They wanted to build bigger engines than the world had ever seen, and machines that could turn out products by the millions. The young nation had adopted the Latin motto, E pluribus unum, from many one, or one made from many. The go-getters were experts at bringing people together. Just as earlier Americans had organized 13 new colonies in a new nation, so now the go-getters brought later Americans together in their cattle trains, oil companies, department stores, and thousands of other new enterprises. The new American way of life seemed good for people of every kind. America would not be merely a democracy of people, but also a democracy of things. It would be a long time, maybe forever, before no one was poor, but after the Civil War it became easier for more and more Americans to share the good things of life. The go-getters, without even intending to, were bringing the whole nation together. Some of the go-getters were more honest than others. Some made their fortunes by new ideas, by hard work, by being clever. Some were simply lucky. All prospered from the continent's hidden wealth. The go-getters were not satisfied with the slow pace of the old world. They wanted to see things happen fast, and by the early years of the 20th century, the 1900s, they had helped transform American life. Chapter 6. Cattlemen and Cowboys. About the time of the Civil War, the Western cattle trade became big business. The men who made money from it were as different as possible from European peasants. The peasants kept their cattle at night in the rooms where they slept. They could keep only a few animals because their houses were small, and they had to feed their animals by hand in winter. The Western cattlemen, by contrast, numbered their stock by thousands. They did not have to give their cattle roofs because Western cattle were tough enough to look after themselves on the range, and buffalo grass grew on the great Western plains, and it survived drought and provided free food right on the ground throughout the winter. Western cattlemen were bold and adventurous. They were willing to take big risks in a wild country. In the Old World, the expression man on horseback meant a military man, a commander of troops, and that he might use to take over the government. But in the American West, the man on horseback was a cowboy, and the Western cattleman was a go-getter on horseback. One of the first and most energetic of these Western cattlemen was John Wesley Eliff. His father, an Ohio farmer, had offered him $7,500 if he would settle nearby on a respectable Ohio farm. But in 1856, Eliff heard of the fortunes farther west, and he wanted adventure. So he told his father he would be satisfied with $500 if he could use it to make his start in the West. Eliff did not find gold in the Colorado mountain streams, but he did find it in the cattle that came there with Americans pushing westward. During the Colorado Gold Rush, July 1858 to February 1861, thousands of covered wagons arrived near Denver, and because they wanted to climb into the mountains, they wanted to lighten their loads, so they shed most of their belongings so they could go ahead on foot or with a few pack mules. They were glad to sell to Eliff the footsore oxen that had pulled their wagons across the plains. He fed these cattle free on the open range that belonged to everybody. He began breeding a herd. When the animals were full grown, Eliff sold them to butchers in the mining camps and to travelers returning east who needed oxen to pull their wagons. Of course, there were risks, especially from winter weather and from Indian attacks. Eliff became friendly with a man named Gary, a pioneer fur trader who had married the twin daughters of Chief Swiftbird of the Oglalas. Using the information from his wives, Gary warned Alif whenever the Indians were about to attack. That way, Alif was always able to move his cattle to a safe place. For a go-getter like Alif, even the Indians became a source of profit. He made a small fortune supplying meat to the remote western outposts where the federal government was sending troops to fight the Indians. At the same time, he also sold beef to government officials so they could feed the Indians on reservations. When the railroads promoted by Eastern go-getters pushed west, they opened another new market. They permitted the Western cattle growers to ship beef to the growing Eastern cities. At the same time, hard-working crews that were building the railroads had to eat, and what they most wanted was meat. Alif agreed to deliver cattle by the thousands to the Union Pacific Railroad construction gangs and to the troops that were guarding them against the Indians. This was easier said than done. Alif had to find more beef than anyone had ever seen in one place, and he had to bring it to the middle of nowhere where railroads had yet to come. Another brand of go-getter, the Western Trailblazer, helped Alif. One of the oldest of them was a remarkable man with the unlikely name of Charles Goodnight. His family had taken him to Texas when he was a boy of 9. In 1868, Goodnight agreed to deliver 40,000 worth of cattle from Texas to Alif's camp near Cheyenne, Wyoming. When Americans had come to Texas in the 1830s, thousands of longhorn cattle were running wild. These were the great-great-grandchildren of a few animals brought over by the Spanish explorers in the 1500s. To get your herd, all you had to do was hunt and capture. Hunting wild cattle became a prosperous business, but it was not child's play. The wild cattle of Texas, one hunter reported, were 50 times more dangerous than the fiercest buffalo. These bold beasts were armed with sharp horns that they were not afraid to use. Men on foot could not manage them. They made the Texas cowboy get onto his horse, and they kept him there. It was 1,000 miles from the cattle country of central Texas to Goodnight's promised delivery point in southeastern Wyoming. You had to cross some of the driest, most unfriendly land in the whole continent. Maps before the Civil War called it the Great American Desert. In all that country, there was no town worthy of the name. There was not even any trail. To deliver his cattle, Goodnight had to find his own way. It would be a risky business, but it seemed worth trying. A steer bought for $4 in Texas sold for $40 in Wyoming. Multiply that by 3,000, the number of cattle Goodnight hoped to take on each trip, and it added up to a handsome profit. The Texas Longhorns were well equipped for long trips. Their sense of smell, the cowboy said, was as much superior to that of an ordinary eastern cow as the bloodhound's was to that of a parlor poodle. Where water was hard to find, the Longhorn's nose for water could make the difference between life and death. Cowboys who let the leading steer act as guide sometimes found remote lakes that they had never seen before. The real problem was how to keep all those 3,000 cattle together and moving at just the right speed. If they stopped or dawdled, they might never reach their goal. But if they trotted, they might get out of control or exercise off the weight that was worth money in Wyoming. Stationed at the front or point of the herd were 2 of the most experienced men, called pointers. They navigated for the whole herd. They followed the course set beforehand by the foreman. Bringing up the rear were 3 steady cowboys whose job was to look out for the weaker cattle, the drags. To prevent the herd from straggling out for miles, the whole party moved no faster than the weakest drags at the rear. The rest of the cowboy crew rode along the sides to keep the herd compact and all the same width. Every herd of cattle on the trail needed its own herd of horses to give the cowboys fresh mounts for their tricky jobs. To feed the men, you needed a chuck wagon that the cook would drive fast ahead of everybody else. His job was to have food ready as soon as the weary cowboys arrived. Communication between the front and the rear of the herd was difficult. The rumbling of hooves smothered words. The cowboys then borrowed a clever system of hand signals from the Plains Indians. Apart from Indians, the greatest peril was a stampede. At night, the 3,000 cattle, which a moment before had been quietly dozing, might suddenly rouse into a thundering mass. To stop a stampede, experienced cowboys made a circle to keep the animals churning and circling, always round to the right. Then, by tightening their circle, they squeezed the stampeding cattle tighter and tighter until, together, they had no place to run. They were thus able to force the milling herd to a halt. If the encircling tactic failed, all was lost. The stampede would get out of control. The cattle would fly out like sparks into the night, and they might never be seen again. The cowboys had their own trail-tested ways of preventing stampedes by soothing the jumpy longhorns. The men guarding the herd at night would sing and whistle while they made their rounds. The purpose of the serenading, the veteran cowboy Andy Adams explained, was that the sleeping herd may know that a friend and not an enemy is keeping vigil over their dreams. The cowboys called these songs hymns because they sang them to tunes they remembered from their mothers' songs in childhood or from church services. But the words the cattle sang usually were not church words. What they sang might have shocked or startled the cattle if they could have understood, for these cowboys sang songs told the exploits of famous horse races and notorious criminals, or they repeated advertising text from coffee cans or whiskey bottles, or they recited profanities sprinkled between nonsense syllables. At the end of the long drive came the cow town. This was as American as the cowboy. It was simply another smaller kind of instant city, like those already dotted over the West. The cow town was where cowboys delivered their herds to the cattle dealers and the railroads. There, after long, lonely weeks on the trail, cowherds enjoyed the company of strangers. They bought liquor and gambled away their money. Go-getting cattlemen made these instant towns prosper. One cattleman, Joseph G. McCoy, picked a place along the Kansas Pacific Railroad. In 1867, when he first made his plans for Abilene, it was, as he later recalled, a very small dead place. It consisted of about a dozen log huts. They were low, small, rude affairs. Most used turf, prairie grass, as roofing. Indeed, there was only one shingle roof in the whole city. The town leaders conducted their business in 2 small rooms, mere log huts, and of course, you could find the inevitable saloon. It also came in a log hut. But within 60 days, McCoy transformed the place as if by magic. Abilene acquired a shipping yard for 3,000 head of cattle. It also gained a large pair of Fairbanks scales on which to weigh the cattle. It had a big barn, an office, and a good 3-story hotel. The idea was to ship out thousands of cattle from Abilene to Chicago and other big cities. The first shipment, 20 carloads of cattle, was scheduled to leave Abilene on September 5, 1867. Chicago stockmen had come to celebrate. In tents specially erected for the occasion, they feasted, drank wine, sang, and listened to bombastic speeches. Before the end of that year, Abilene shipped out 35,000 head of cattle. Go-getting McCoy had paid only $2,400 for the whole Abilene town site. Before long, he received an offer for more than that for a single city lot. He received from the Kansas Pacific Railroad a commission of 1/8 of the freight charges on every carload of cattle. Before the end of the second year, the railroad company owed McCoy $250,000. Soon there were other prospering cow towns sprinkled all over the West: Schuyler, Fort Kearny, North Platte, Ogallala, and Sidney in Nebraska, Pine Bluffs, Rock River, Rock Creek, Laramie, Hillsdale, and Cheyenne in Wyoming, Miles City, Glendive, and Helena in Montana. The cow towns did not suffer from modesty. More than one boasted that she was the queen of cow towns, but Dodge City and Kansas and others competed for the title of the wickedest little city in America. While town building was profitable and exciting, prosperous cattlemen still fondly remembered their days on the trail. All in all, my years on the trail were the happiest I ever lived, Charles Goodnight remembered on his 93rd birthday. There were many hardships and dangers, of course, that called on all a man had of endurance and bravery, but when all went well, there was no other life so pleasant. Most of the time we were solitary adventurers in a great land as fresh and new as a spring morning, and we were free and full of the zest of darers. Western cattlemen and cowboys were among the first and bravest of the go-getters. They tried the impossible and succeeded in making something from nothing. They captured wild cattle that belonged to nobody. Then they fed the cattle on buffalo grass that nobody even imagined could be food. They grazed them on range that belonged to everybody and nobody. And finally, they transported the cattle on their very own feet for thousands of miles to places where they could become beef. Who could have imagined that the great American desert would become the greatest beef factory in the world?